Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Q&A for part 2 of Compass. So the first question, Josumosu asked, "Hey Matthew, how do you get started with puzzle design, or what advice would you give to a complete beginner with an interest in designing their own puzzles?" I mean, I feel like I covered some of that in the first part of the course, although, you know, the general like beginner advice of how do you get started is kind of you just start doing it, and you're gonna suck at first, but eventually you'll get better. What is that from Adventure Time? Sucking at something is the first step on the road to being kind of good at something. So everything's sort of like that. As cheesy as that is, it's sort of true. As far as, you know, learning things about designing puzzles, I tried to address this part of the course on that as much as I could. I don't know that there's any like specific things that I would point to other than stuff that I said already in this part. There's certainly like books and things that I've looked at over the years, but there was nothing that was maybe a radical change other than Elliot Grant teaching me the forwards design method for puzzles, which I try to outline as much as possible in this part. So hopefully this thing was helpful, but as far as just like making stuff, just get started. How did I get started? Probably the same way. I started like prototyping puzzle games. So which is really just like you make something that has some kind of like interesting system or whatever, and then you kind of like try to build things that showcase that. Okay. Doctor Who Kobe, Twin Peaks reference, asks, if your game has few mechanics, Steven Sausage Roll, for example, how would you go about finding new ideas when you've already explored many ideas and the matrix method doesn't work? This is kind of a hard question to answer because it's sort of like, it depends on the specifics of the game that you were making. But, you know, let's say Steven Sausage Roll in particular, like Steven Sausage Roll has a lot of sub rules. So there's a lot of like different situations in the game that would arise. And then it's a matter of like the complexity of the game sort of came out of deciding what was going to happen in those situations. But, you know, that game's a very unusually natural design, in that almost all of the things that happen in the game seem like the right thing to happen, right? You know, you could do some things a little bit differently, right? There's some arbitrary decisions like that you have to climb the ladder from the side or whatever. But as far as like finding new ideas, like in that space particularly, it seems like, well, you just explore the space and, oh, okay, I haven't defined what happens if you like get pushed off of a ledge backwards, right? So I should maybe define what happens there, right? Because I've like created a situation where that can happen. Yeah, you know, so matrix method of like this thing in the game, I'm like charting out the things in the game and do they interact or not, and it's not, you're not capable of finding new interactions in that space. You can always add new things to the game, right? You can always add more stuff. We outlined that in the first part of the course, right? Sometimes you can add new mechanics in order to make things more interesting. I don't want to repeat myself too much because we do have a lot of questions. Okay. So Patrick Trainer asked a few questions here. The first one was, what about situations where the surprise is spoiled by simplifying levels too much, where there's literally nothing to do but the surprise interaction? So this is another thing where I feel like I brushed on it at least a little bit, which was the bit about not making levels too easy. You know, I think there's always a balance to be struck with like any level that you're making, right? It's like how, like, you want it to be clear. You want the subject matter to be clear. You want the player to solve the level and understand what it was about. At least in the aesthetics that, you know, I'm I'm focused on in this course. So that's like the main criteria. And yeah, there's other criteria of like, well, I want the level to be surprising. And if you can have the level be surprising, or you can make that a little tricky without distracting too much from the main point of the level, then that's, I think, a good thing to pursue, right? So you don't want to prune down like the difficulty to the point that the level becomes automatic and the player is not like, okay, if there's something surprising in the game and you want to have build a puzzle around it, usually the way you want that puzzle to come out is kind of like the player sort of has to think of the idea themselves, because then the player feels clever and the thing that's in the game feels natural, right? You don't want it to like be something they accidentally did in the level. It's like this game which I was playing yesterday, which had a level in it where it introduced that there's like world wrapping, right? But it introduced that in a, oh, you have to accidentally walk off the edge of the level and realize that you get warped to the other side, which was just not a very fun surprise because I just did it accidentally. It wasn't part of like me thinking about how would I solve this level. It was just like, oh, I guess that's a thing. So yeah, it's equivalent to the thing of, yeah, I talked about this in the first part of the course a little bit, which was like early on in Taiji, the puzzles automatically checked the solution anytime you made any change in the puzzle. And this meant sometimes people are like, oh, I want to adjust this, and it's solved in the middle of them like doing something. And that does not feel good because they get surprised by the puzzle being solved, which is not a good surprise, right? What you want is the player to think that they've got the solution. Like that's the part where you have that aha moment. And if you interrupt that by having it like accidentally get solved, or in the case of you know, a Sokoban type level or something, they accidentally discover that there's a move, or the level's so straightforward that like the only thing they could do was the thing. Now it depends on how obscure the thing is, right? Like if the move that you're doing in the game is like really obscure and they're unlikely to guess, then maybe you really do need to funnel them through it, and you just have to accept that that's not going to be a moment of surprise for the player. It's just going to be like a given that that's how the thing works. But that could also be a sign of maybe the thing's too contrived, but it depends, right? So, okay. Another question by Patrick. The distinction between what's beautiful and what's esoteric is interesting. I feel like one person's trash is another's treasure. How much variance in this taste do you think people have? So there's definitely a variance in taste there. Obviously, you know, Bun Burrows is like overwhelmingly positive reviews on Steam. So you could say that I'm wrong for not liking the game, right? Because it's a very popular game. People like the game a lot, right? So a lot of people don't mind that it's like arbitrary, esoteric stuff that you have to memorize that generates the complexity of the levels, right? But I do think it's like outside of the aesthetic that the course is focused on, and I don't personally like that kind of thing very much because I just don't find it surprising in a way. Well, I don't even really find it surprising at all, right? I said that in this part of the course, like it's not surprising if you have something that's arbitrary and complicated that weird things happen that you wouldn't expect, right? It's like, of course, the thing's arbitrary and complicated. Of course, there's weird things that are going to happen. So yeah. Okay, Patrick asks another question. This is a bit more of a pointed question. Do you have any specific examples from Taiji that in retrospect you would remove noise from? I think I would have to think a lot about this to have a specific example. There's definitely puzzles in the game, like opportunities where, okay, I need to have a puzzle here. Like, so typically with the sections that mixed in mechanics from here and a mechanic from here, I would want to have like a kind of progression where it gets harder, and then there's sort of like a hard puzzle or a big boss puzzle or something, right? I tried to do that, and there's certainly spots where that's better than others. And I think like the weakest spots for me were always the diamonds mixed with the dice pips. That was like the weakest mix in, and then the dice pips mixed with the shapes. I mean, I like some of the stuff in both of those sections, but they're kind of weak. But that's not necessarily answering the question of like puzzles that I would remove noise from. But I do think particularly that like big boss puzzle for the dice plus shapes is kind of, it's kind of a puzzle that doesn't have a strong idea to it beyond just mixing those two things together. So there's puzzles that I feel like are weaker in terms of their ideas, for sure. But I don't know that there's puzzles where I feel like I added too much noise. It's just some puzzles don't have as strong of ideas as the best puzzles in the game. I mean, I think that that's always going to happen. You know, you can't like, they can't all be bangers, right? So, but you know, a lot of stuff, it's like I went through revisions and I tried to like revise it and make it better. And there's some things like that that I look at and I'm like, maybe I could have done better. I don't know. I don't know if that answers the question, because it's not like a specific puzzle that I look at and I say, oh yeah, this is kind of messy, right? There's definitely puzzles that I removed noise from in development. A real big example of that would be the tree puzzle that's in the water, where it's got the reflection of the tree that you can see. That had a lot of effort put into making it cleaner, right? Because the original idea for the puzzles, I just wanted to have like a lot of going back and forth between the reflection and the regular tree to try to like piece together all the information about it. And the problem is because you only have like one perspective of the tree, and no matter how well I draw the tree, and I did try to improve how well I drew the tree, some players are going to get confused about what they're looking at. So it ended up being vastly pared back to where it's like there's one thing that you have to like look at the reflection and the thing to piece together, but everything else, like you can just look at one or the other and you can tell. And then it ends up being a better puzzle because there's just so much possibility of difficulty in parsing what you're looking at, right? Okay, so next question is from xspike127. How do you distinguish what is a contrived idea and a natural or beautiful one? Is it mostly instinctual, or does it have to do with something else? So that's somewhat similar to Patrick's question about how much variance in taste is there on that. So I do think it is a little bit of a matter of personal opinion. I don't necessarily want to say taste, because I think taste is, well, I think taste has to do with what you would recommend to other people, and not just what you like personally, right? But generally things that involve a lot of pieces that are put in relative to the surprise or what you get out of that are things that are contrived, right? So it's sort of a balancing act, right? Where you want to have like, you don't want to have to like put too many things into a puzzle or into the game to get interesting stuff out, right? You want it to be in balance, right? So you certainly know, like, if you open up a level in a game and like it looks like some kind of Rube Goldberg device, that your initial reaction is, oh God, like this is really complicated. And so it is, to some extent, there's a large amount of contrivance there that you can immediately detect. The question as to like in the end whether or not the level like feels contrived is mostly going to come down to like, was what the level got out of that worth it in the end, right? Because that's like a huge down payment, and it's like, well, it better get a lot out of this idea. Otherwise, maybe it's not worth it. Let me turn that off, because I feel like I'm shouting over a space heater here, but I'm trying to keep myself warm. But it's warm enough for now. Okay. All right, so this is not really a specific question, but there were some people who commented about the Can of Wormholes noisiness example. And we're sort of stating things that I think are obvious things to state, but I just wanted to like discuss it a little bit. And commenting that like, well, the level's not really unclear, or they don't mind it personally, the noisiness of the level. And so I do think that I could have been a little bit clearer on that point, because there's just a lot of stuff to think about and talk about with that level, including explaining to some extent the mechanics of Can of Wormholes for people that have never played the game. But my main point there was just that that level is the very first level that introduces dots in the game, and it's very noisy while doing it. And that noise is not only off topic for the level, but it's off topic for the entire game. And in your early levels in a game, you particularly want to be very clear about introducing the style or the approach of the puzzle designs in the game, right? If the first few puzzles you do in the game are all about like fiddly movement or something, then a player is going to think this is a game that's about fiddly movement. And if the rest of the game is not like that, then you've sort of given a false first impression. And so you just need to be very careful with those levels. So that's like part of why I treated that level the way that I did. It's not a level divorced from all context, right? Like in the context of the game, this is like the third level in the game. And so that in that context, having a level that's like asking me to do something that's not that interesting or complicated, but over complicating it by making the level harder to read and messy, is just suggestive that that's what the game is going to do for the rest of it to try to be interesting, which it generally doesn't. So at least not to that degree of on purposeness. Okay. All right. So another question from xspike127. I feel like if you have 0 off-topic difficulty, then the actual consequences of an interesting but simple interaction become too easy to see and therefore less interesting or rewarding. This is another thing that kind of is similar to Patrick's question earlier, about like oversimplifying a puzzle. So it's sort of it's like, where do you draw the line about what's off-topic difficulty, and where do you draw the line about what's a competing topic, right? So I think there's sort of a spectrum there where like you can have other things in the level that's some amount of noise or some amount of misdirection before it becomes off-topic difficulty, which might be something like the things that I outlined in there, like, oh, it's hard to make the jump in a puzzle platformer, right? It's like, and so I'm sitting there being like, did I do it right? I don't know if I did it right or if I did it wrong, and I just should try something else, right? Maybe I did it right and I missed the jump, right? That would be off-topic difficulty because it's distracting from the whole point of the puzzle by making the focus of the player be sort of about something else. You know, it's like in the polarization example, which there was another like thing here. I believe No Radine was asking this or saying something about, is the solution too unique or something? It's like, what was the issue with the small version of the polarization level? But it sort of dovetails with this question that we're on. Which is that the problem there is making the level small means that there's a lot of effort that the player has to expend in like shuffling these pieces around to try to even get them into the position that they want to do. And the focus of the level becomes split between, okay, I want to dig this piece out of this hole, so I got to make some kind of tool and pull it out, versus, oh, it's really hard for me to make the tool, right? And so the question is really, as a designer, like, where do I want the focus of the level to be? And it's hard to make the tool that I want to make focus is sort of a very common and mundane truth, right? It's like a mundane thing about all Sokoban games, that if you have a small room, it's hard to move boxes around in the room, right? And so it's better, I think, to focus the level on the unique thing that's like very unique to this game. Okay, so hopefully that covers that question. All right, Jagrif asks, how can you train yourself to find the sweet spot of interestingness in a puzzle that still remains focused but isn't trivial? So how can you train yourself? Well, I think certainly the more you play these kinds of games, like if you play similar games, or if you just play your own game and you spend a lot of time with the puzzles in the game, the more you'll recognize the kinds of ideas that are unusual in that game and the ones that are really common, right? And so I think it starts to be about that, about recognizing like what kinds of things are very common in this game and what kinds of things they sort of happen on accident, and what are the unusual things. And so your puzzles should be focused as much as possible on those unusual things without getting distracted too much by like the common difficulties, right? So the obvious thing was what I just said before about Sokoban levels, where shuffling around boxes in a small room is a very common difficulty in a Sokoban game. And so if you're making a Sokoban game that's about magnets or whatever, then like you don't want too much of the game to be about the very common thing, because you have this unique thing here and you should be, you know, focusing on that. Okay. Next question is another one by Dr. Hukobi. Regarding simplifying puzzles, what about puzzles not intended to teach things, but rather use what you've learned? In that case, is it better to keep it focused or have multiple aha moments? Okay, so this is asking about not insight puzzles, but exercise puzzles, right? There's a point in before where they were called maze puzzles, and that took forever to prune out and figure out was a bad thing to call them. But anyway, so exercise puzzles. So, right, okay, so I think this just depends on like how parsable is the level to the player, like how focused is it, right? So I think if you have multiple ideas, now this is something that'll get covered a bit in the third part of the course where I talk about sub puzzles, which is sort of like a way that you can kind of, inside of like a Sokoban level or something, you can sort of have little micro puzzles that you can think about on their own, which is one way that you can have variations on a topic or different types of ideas introduced in one puzzle, because you can sort of cordon off a part of the puzzle and you don't have to like think about that anymore after you solve it. So that's one way you can do that. Another thing is just like, well, I generally think it does need to be something where you can, there's some kind of linear path to it, right? Where like you're not having to think about competing ideas too much, because unless the level's just about combining those things, right? So I'm not sure, it's important to understand that I'm not somebody who's spent a ton of time designing those kinds of levels, right? I made Taiji, so I spent a lot of time making kind of pen and paper type puzzles. So the approach that you use for that versus something that's like a Sokoban puzzle or like a puzzle platformer or Talos Principle or something is somewhat different. But in both cases, I think it had that would be my like gut reaction is that like it's okay to have shifting ideas if they're things that you knew before and you can kind of chain them together in an interesting way. I think like you probably want to limit how much you're just doing the same thing chained together that you've already done before, because if you do that too much, then that gets boring. And that's sort of what I've called labyrinths in the past, which is like not even a maze, right? It's not even a maze puzzle. It's a straight line puzzle where you just have to do things that you've done earlier in the game in order. Those types of things tend to be not so interesting, and it's probably best to just not do that. But I don't know. There's been a few questions in here that I'm like a little bit afraid that I'm not able to answer so well, because I have a lot less experience with the kinds of puzzles where this would be something that you're thinking about so much. Because I think in like, in Taiji puzzles, typically I would think about one main idea for the puzzle, even if it's a puzzle that has like lots of little deductions in it. It's like there's sort of an overall idea. But there were also puzzles in there where it was sort of about intuiting what the solution was, and there's not actually a way to totally deduce it. It's just kind of like part of the game was a little bit of guessing. I don't know. I won't rat hole on that too much, but it does seem like, maybe somebody like Patrick Traynor, who's had a lot of experience with that, would have better answers on those kinds of questions. Okay. This is probably another one. Speaking of Patrick Traynor, Patrick asks, any tips on how to come up with false rejectors or good misdirections when doing level design? That Sokoban example had neat misdirection. Right. So how to come up with false rejectors or good misdirections? Well, that actual example in the course, I sort of just accidentally came up with. So sometimes it happens like that, where it's on accident. You're just sort of playing around with the level design and you get stumped on the level and then realize, oh, actually I can solve it. And that was what happened there. But in general, because I do make a point of caution in there about false rejectors and false confirmers both being things that introduce noise into the level. So it means that it's not so easy for the player to read the level and tell what they can do. So they are sort of a misdirection. It has to do with the complexity of the level overall, right? So if the level is like really complex, then you probably want to avoid having additional complexity by these things. And so it's good to like look out for those things and try to remove them. But, in general, I think these kind of things are something where you have to like test if possible. If you have people play test the level and they're like getting too stuck, then maybe you like adjust some things, you remove some things that are misdirecting, or you add some things that help, add some confirmers, add some rejectors that help funnel the player towards the thing. And you try to go very light with that. At least that's what I would always do. So you try to go light with your changes and see whether it works, because you kind of want to pick the lightest thing that will still work. Now, I guess this does require a certain amount of taste, because if you're going too light, then maybe you end up with a game that's still very noisy, because like people will still struggle through it. So you do have to have a sort of opinion about how much of the struggling that people are having with the level is interesting, right? And again, I think these are things that like it's hard to say, because at least my experience on Taiji was I worked on the game for a long time, and so certain kinds of ideas got boring to me. And so that was how my taste was largely formed, because it was just like when I first started working on the game, it was like anything was interesting. It's just fun to try to figure out whether you can do stuff in this game. And then like the more time I spent with it, it was just kind of like, puzzles where you're just kind of like toggling tiles on and off and hoping that something occurs to you are not so interesting. And so I shouldn't have so many of those, right? Yeah. Okay. So Gregory asks, aren't confirmers and rejectors tools that can be used to design forwards? It seems like you treat the forwards design method and confirmers rejectors as different alternative methods. So this is another one where I don't really know, because I haven't thought about this that much. I know it has come up in pre-screening, so it's possible that they should all kind of be lumped in and thought of in the same way. But for me, it was useful to think about different approaches for different types of puzzles, right? So I certainly knew with Taiji puzzles that forwards design and this kind of chaining deductions and thinking about the puzzle is like things that the player is going to notice, and then they're going to make some kind of adjustment to the puzzle and they're going to notice something else, that's the right way to think about it. But I haven't tried to design a Sokoban game using that approach. So the confirmer rejector thing is something that I've noticed playing, mostly playing Order of the Sinking Star, but some other Sokoban games, I've just noticed that like, oh, there's something here about the level that is telling me something, right? Or it's misdirecting me, right? So as a player, I'm noticing that thing, and I find that there's at least a feel difference between the things. But whether or not they're all part of the same kind of method, I'm not totally sure. And that's kind of one where I'm probably the wrong person, at least at this point, to answer that question, unless I spend a lot more time working on those kind of games. Okay. So Jagriff asks, in the Taste of Hell part of Taiji, how did you decide how much spice to add? Was it heavily influenced by playtesting? I expect that as the designer, your own tolerance was naturally higher. Yeah, I think it was mostly playtesting, right? It was mostly watching people play the puzzles, and they're getting fatigued with it, and I'm also getting fatigued with watching people do the puzzles, which is sort of a meta thing where you realize that like there's a little bit too much of this in the game, because it's just like I feel like I'm torturing these people by making them do these puzzles. Right? It's like at a certain point you start thinking like, ooh, and you're just kind of like cringing watching somebody play your game, because they're, maybe not having a bad time, but you're just sort of like, this is not as interesting. Like the luster has wore off of this idea where I was very feverishly excited about it. And I designed like, I think in that case, it was at least like 6 or 7 puzzles that used that same thing. And then there were some that had like everything was a -2, and isn't that interesting? And, I felt like there was potential there, and there was. It was just like also that it's very frustrating and kind of fiddly in the worst case with those puzzles, right? So that's why in the end I cut that down to where there was just like one puzzle that utilized that idea, because in the worst case you could spend a long time on that one puzzle, in the best case, you know, maybe because it ended up being a bridge puzzle, you kind of limit your options significantly and you can converge on a solution pretty quickly because you know, well, okay, based on what I'm looking at, where it's connected, it's got to be possible to connect to these points, right? But, you know, individual player tolerance or interest in that idea certainly varies. So I don't actually know that it was so much like players raging out or anything like that. Like that didn't happen. It was just sort of like watching people do it and thinking like, is this the kind of thing that I want people to be doing playing this game? And the luster of it wore off over time. And I started to think like, no, not really. And I think for a while that if I recall correctly, basically all of that got cut. And it was only later that I decided that I wanted to put that bridge puzzle in. I might be incorrect about remembering the details, but I think there was a bit where I just totally cut that idea, which kind of makes sense that I would sort of overreact and remove the whole thing from the game. But yeah, that's, I think, sort of how I settled on that. So next question is by Technic Beam, who asks, so far you've mostly covered level design. All the elements already exist. How do I make a good puzzle with them? I'm curious about the actual puzzle design itself. Suppose you have a puzzle idea, but on its own, it's too simple or boring, even too difficult or whatever. How do you explore ideas, for example, adding elements to make it better? Considering that exploration means a lot of coding and hence time, much of which will end up being dead ends, not to mention you need them to fit in with your concept or vision of the game. I'm not really sure I understand exactly what this is asking. I mean, it feels like it's asking about, like, if you don't have elements to design the puzzle, how do you come up with new ideas for stuff? Which I discussed a little bit in the first part of the course, but you know, mostly you just have to experiment with things. Now, in some cases, that's cheaper than others. So like in Taiji, a lot of stuff I could experiment on paper. I have a certain idea of, okay, it would work like this. I can just kind of like draw out some puzzles on paper and see how that works. In other cases, it might be more like you have to implement a thing. So if the question is sort of like, how do you not spend too much time either doing analysis paralysis or just trying out ideas that are dead ends without knowing that they're dead ends? That's a very hard question. On the analysis paralysis thing, my approach has been to kind of try to recognize at some point early on that I'm not making forward progress, and instead I'm just sitting here thinking about too many things, and I should try something even if it seems stupid, right? Because trying something out is better than doing nothing. But you know, there was a very, very bad example of this kind of other thing happening, of not realizing that you have the wrong idea. That happened on Taiji really badly with the end game area, where the first version of that idea was sort of this idea where you were going to have, it was going to be like you had to toggle the tiles on the thing and you had to make something that any set of symbols, and you'd have these set of symbols, right? So there's like 4 diamonds or something, that the puzzle would be solvable with those symbols, right? And so it was like, okay, the computer has to grind through the possibilities for the puzzle that you drew to make sure that it's solvable. And I spent about 6 months on that because it required a lot of work to get that to be fast for puzzles that were more than just a trivial size. And I was almost done with getting it there. And then it finally occurred to me that this was probably a dead end design wise, and that I was kind of making the computer do the interesting part of the puzzle. And so it occurred to me to like flip that design around. And so you end up with what's in the final game, right? But I don't know, other than just at some point it occurred to me that, like, you know, I still don't know if this is interesting, right? Because I got very laser focused into the technical challenge of getting the thing to validate your puzzle quickly, right? And so that was just like churning away at that and making sure that I implemented all the mechanics and getting them to be done quickly, right? Which was an interesting problem. And so I sort of just rat holed on that and focused on that. And next thing I know, 6 months go by and I'm like, you know, I still don't know whether this makes interesting puzzles or not, because it's sort of like dependent on the thing existing to tell. And I've spent a lot of time on this and I still don't know. So maybe I should reconsider this approach. So, but that doesn't help you avoid that thing. It doesn't even help me avoid the thing, other than just like, you have to try to have some kind of meta awareness of what you're doing and what you're spending your time doing, and is it productive? And it could either be unproductive in, I'm sitting here doing nothing, just thinking about things, and I can't know until I put something in the game, so I should just put something in the game. Or it just takes too long to put the thing in the game that I'm putting in there, and somehow, even though the entire choice of designs that I focus on for, I don't know, past when I was a teenager, like when I was a teenager, I often would pick a design focus that involved some technical challenge. Like, oh, I want to have like trees that blow in the wind and there's physics and you're going to be a squirrel and you're going to be able to jump on the branches and they're going to sway and you're going to be able to use the momentum to, anyway, like stuff that was technically hard to pull off, at least for me. I shifted to, no, I'm going to go with like super duper simple technical designs, but yet somehow I found myself like, let's do this thing that's technically hard to pull off for the ending. And you can convince yourself that like, no, that's going to be impressive because it's technically hard to pull off. But yeah, it was a big waste of time. I mean, it was fun, but yeah, I don't know. So, okay, let's see. Next question. Warp Pipe asks, I got a bit lost with false confirmer rejectors. Is the idea just to use misdirection with confirmers and rejectors, or is it possible to do something like that without misdirection? So false confirmers and false rejectors are always misdirection because they're telling you something that's not true about the puzzle, right? It's an element of the puzzle. So, for example, that thing, the puzzle where you went into the hallway and you pushed it in and, oh, I can't get the block out, right? That's a false rejector because it's telling you I can't push the block through this hallway and get it out, right? So it's always a misdirection because that's not true. You just have to do it a little bit differently, right? You have to go around the other way and whatever, right? So that's always a misdirection. Whereas confirmers and rejectors are always a like directive element. They're always telling you something about the level that's true to try to point you towards the solution, right? Either by telling you, yes, do this thing, or no, don't do this thing, right? Hopefully that clarifies. All right. So last question. Spike V asks, if you have anything more to say on the movement system in Steven Sosterol and his connection to game feel mentioned in Talk 1, I'd be interested to hear it. Right. So this is an interesting question that did come up in some discussions after the first part of the course, because I'm not sure if it was you, but somebody was talking to me about a game that they were making, and they were saying it's kind of similar to Steven Sosterol in that the movement is kind of weird feeling. And they were asking, like, how do I get to the interesting part and not have players be lost on the movement? Now, I'm not going to necessarily answer that question because this question's a little more broad, but well, I don't think Steven Sosterdahl crosses the line to where it becomes too annoying, but I do personally have a problem with some of the early puzzles in Steven Sosterdahl because I don't think that they're that interesting of puzzles. Although it is true that it is a sandbox to some extent for the player to get used to the movement, which is weird, you know. It's not too weird, it's just a little weird because it's kind of like what a direction does kind of depends on the direction that you're currently facing, right? Like, do you move that direction or do you turn that direction? Depends on whether you're already facing that direction. In the case of that game, the weird movement buys you a lot of interesting puzzles over the course of the game, and so I think it's ultimately worth it. And I also don't think that the early puzzles, the problem that they have is inherent to that movement. So it's not the same thing as like A Little Perspective, the isometric game where it's, you know, it's kind of like Monument Valley, where like what you see is what the level design is, but it's more puzzly. Anyway, we mentioned it in the first part of the course. It's not like that, where that game, it's like inherent in the design that this annoying stuff is going to happen, right? And that's going to persist across the whole game. In Steven Sosterdahl, it's like you get to where you master that movement probably by the end of the first world, and so that's not a thing that persists across the rest of the game. And to me, the problem with those early puzzles is that they're kind of rabbit trail soup pruning puzzles that are trying too hard to make something that's not that interesting. But I don't know, you know, I'm not sure. Would it be a better game if the start had puzzles that were simpler and easier and you got to the levels with walls a bit faster? I'm not sure. Maybe it would run into problems where you're struggling with the movement on puzzles that are too conceptually difficult for you to handle at that point. I don't know, because that would be a different game, because you can't just say, oh, well, we'll change the entire start of the game and then like everything about the rest of the game is going to be the same. Like the stuff about the next area is going to feel different because the context in which you approach it is different. Okay. Well, that's all the questions. And so I thank you again for joining us. And it's been a bunch of people showing up, so that's really nice. Hopefully you all will join for the third and final part of the course. I think that it gets more interesting as it goes on. So I think that it's the most interesting part. So hope to see you there. And thanks again.